I did, yeah, that's the zigzag.
Very pretty.
Thank you.
So apparently my Zoom needs updated because it's giving me fits this morning.
Yeah, my camera's is doing some funky stuff. So if I go on and off, because what I view, it's bouncing around. I don't know if you guys see that. Oh, okay, thanks.
All right, well, should we get going?
Go for it.
All right, well, good morning, committee members and those joining on YouTube. For the record, my name is Dan Brown and I co-chair the grant committee meeting with Barbara Boyer. We want to remind you all that this is a virtual meeting and is being streamed live on OWEB's YouTube channel and recorded. For those watching on YouTube, the meeting materials are in the on the OWEB website. If you go to board and committee section, you'll find the committee materials toward the bottom of the page, and you can click on the relevant committee and have access to the meeting materials for this meeting, as well as any past meetings. I'd like to call on committee members and OWEB staff members to introduce themselves, and I think I'm just looking at my screen here. So why don't I start with Barbara as the co-chair?
Good morning. I am Barbara Boyer. I sit on the OWEB board as the co-chair, the current co-chair, with Liza Jane McAllister. And I sit on this board representing the State Board of Agriculture.
Thank you, Barbara. Why don't we go to Lindsay?
Good morning, everybody. Lindsay McClary, public at large voting member. I live in West Salem and I work for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde.
Thank you, Liza. Liza Jane.
Good morning, everyone. Liza Jane McAllister. I'm currently co-chair with Barbara for OWEB and live in Northeast Oregon in Wallowa County and represent the public at large.
Thank you, Liza Jane. Chris.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm a non-voting advisory member of OWEB board and serving on this committee representing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
All right, Elizabeth.
You can call me Liz. Hi, good morning,
Liz.
everyone. I'm here in sunny, for now, Medford, Oregon. And I represent the Oregon Board of Forestry. I'm a member there and brand new here.
All right. Jillian.
Good morning, everyone. It's Jillian McCarthy, Partnerships Coordinator with OWEB.
Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Voting member Mark Labhart, representing the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife as a commissioner, and I live in Sisters.
All right. I think that's all the OWEB board members. I'm gonna call on Lisa.
Good morning, everybody. Lisa Sharplow Hansen, Executive Director with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Eric.
Good morning,
Williams.
everybody. Eric Williams, Grant Program Manager at OWEB.
Eric Hartstein.
Yeah, there's always at least two of us here. So good morning, Eric Hartstein, Board and Legislative Policy Coordinator at OWEB.
And Denise.
Good morning, Denise Hoffert, Partnerships Coordinator at OWEB, coming to you from mostly cloudy Albany.
All right. And Ivy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Ivy Clark Henry with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, coming from you from Salem.
All right. I think the rest of the folks on the call are here for public comment, so we'll have them introduce themselves later on in the agenda, unless I missed somebody. Did I miss anybody? Okay. So aside from the introductions, the agenda has 3 items on it. the public comments, the FIP land acquisition guidance, and the grant committee schedule. And so we're planning on covering those in order. And unless someone has questions or comments on the agenda itself, I will hand it over to Barbara to get us going.
Thank you, Dan. So April or Ivy, are you managing the public comment today?
Ivy, yes.
Ivy is, yeah, I don't have the list. I just know there's some people signed up.
Yeah, we have about 4 people signed up, and 3 are in the meeting right now.
Okay.
Natasha Bells, Dan Bell, and Dan Roy.
Natasha, Dan, and the other, I'm sorry.
Dan Bell and Dan Roy, and Amanda Martino just joined the meeting as well. Those are all 4.
Okay. And then just for the public, if they have not pulled up our agenda and the materials for today's meeting, we did receive public comment from Columbia Land Trust, and that is a written comment. But Dan, you're gonna speak today too, but I just like to acknowledge the fact that we did receive some written also. So Natasha, I'm gonna call upon you first, please. So you've got 3 minutes.
Great, thank you. Good morning, OWEB Grants Committee members. My name is Natasha Bellis, and I'm the Conservation Director at the Deschutes Land Trust. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today on Agenda Item 3, the draft FIP application land acquisition guidance. The Deschutes Land Trust is based in Bend, Oregon, and serves the entire Deschutes Basin. We consider OWEB an essential partner in our work to conserve and care for the lands, waters, and communities that sustain Central Oregon. To date, we've partnered with OWEB to permanently conserve over 9,000 acres. That's roughly half of our protected lands, over 1,300 acres of which were conserved with FIP dollars. We're deeply concerned that the proposed land acquisition application requirements for FIP in front of the committee today will unduly restrict land acquisitions funded by OWEB statewide, limiting OWEB's and land trust ability to protect and restore healthy watersheds. Specifically, we oppose the second and third requirements. The second requirement calls for the submission of a signed option agreement or letter of intent with each acquisition project proposed in the work plan. OWEB already requires that a signed landowner acknowledgement with statement of value accompany any land acquisition application. And this is an application that all land acquisition projects must complete, regardless of funding source. If OWEB staff have determined this current requirement is insufficient for FIP funded projects specifically, it has failed to articulate why. The third requirement states that substitute or additional projects will not be accepted after board approval of the respective biennial spending plans in July of odd-numbered years. This severely limits land trust's ability to adapt to changing circumstances, such as death and divorce, and act on priority actions identified in our strategic action plans. Here in the Deschutes, we see this happening more frequently, and in fact, FIP funding was critical in helping us make such a pivot to purchase our Ochoco Preserve in 2017. This is a property that was listed unexpectedly on the market. With this requirement in place, Land Trust would have no timely access to state funding to pursue opportunistic yet priority projects, as current FIP rules prohibit us from accessing open solicitation funding in geographies where a FIP is funding land acquisitions. We understand that the complexity of land acquisition limits OWEB's ability to timely and effectively administer land acquisition grants. But the guidance before you today proposes to treat these challenges by creating barriers and limiting the number of land acquisitions funded by OWEB. The Deschutes Land Trust would like to see OWEB take a more collaborative approach to problem solving and stands ready to support OWEB in creating workable solutions together that allow for the funding of more, not less, land acquisition projects. Land conservation has been identified as a critical tool in conserving biodiversity and increasing climate resiliency. As one of the only state funding sources of funding for land acquisition in Oregon, OWEB's support of these projects is critical. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Natasha. We really appreciate you coming today and giving us that information. So moving on down to Dan Bell, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the time. It's good to see you. My name is Dan Bell. I'm coming to you today wearing 3 different hats. First, I am the Land Trust Director from Friends of the Columbia Gorge, based out of Hood River, and have more than 20 years of land acquisition experience for conservation transactions. I'm also the COLT Board President and representing the Land Trust community across the state of Oregon. And finally, I also sit on one of the technical review teams for the East Cascades Oak Partnership, one of the new FIPs. I want to start off by agreeing with everything that Natasha has just said. As a land trust professional, it really is very critical that we approach transactions with landowners in the most strategic and delicate way possible. Your proposed requirements force land trusts to maybe work outside the normal course of negotiations or conversations with the landowner to needlessly put in a letter of support or option agreement at a very early time when it might not be appropriate for that particular transaction. The entire land trust community is very concerned about the proposed rules 2 and 3. In particular, number 3 would really take away any and all flexibility within a FIP to adapt to changing circumstances. I know that OWEB refers to these transactions as opportunistic. Instead, we prefer to refer to them as circumstantial. Circumstances change very quickly in the real estate market. Natasha identified a couple of things that might cause that. But the rule as it's currently written would allow for no escape ramp, no flexibility whatsoever. There's not a route to the board or otherwise to change, to make necessary changes to land acquisition within a biennium. Finally, as a technical review team member, a relatively new technical review team member, I really want to call out what I see as a real hindrance here in the land acquisition program. And that is that as a technical review team member, I see applications for restoration, for monitoring, for outreach, but I never see applications for land acquisition. Some of the particular examples that were called out in our conversation with Eric and Lisa last week, in my mind, could have been easily resolved before they ever made it to OWEB, had the technical review team been involved in a land acquisition conversation before a grant application was submitted directly to OWEB. When we spoke, Kelly Beamer and I spoke with Eric and Lisa last week. We were encouraged to hear that that OWEB was willing to continue working with the land trust community to refine these rules. We recognize the challenges that some of these present, but these are overly restrictive rules put in place for a couple of circumstances and really do not reflect the high functioning partnerships that are operating around the state within the FIP program. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate you coming today. I am going to move on down to Dan Roy. Did I say your last name correctly?
It's Roix, actually, but thank you
Okay.
for asking. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Dan Roix, Conservation Director with Columbia Land Trust. I've been on staff with Columbia Land Trust for 15 years, working on land acquisition, conservation projects in Oregon and Washington, and had several years experience in California before that. And I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief because we submitted a written comment letter on Friday, and hopefully you all have access to that. It largely echoes what you heard from Natasha and Dan Bell. We are opposed in particular to requirements or restrictions number 2 and 3 on the proposal that was in the packet. And for the reasons that have been explained here, I guess I want to just highlight that the focused investment partnerships are a great strategy that OWEB is using to deliver on its mission. And a lot of resources and effort have gone into those strategies. And the OWEB has supported and funded, in many cases, the development of these very detailed strategic action plans, the development of really strong functional partnerships that look at key conservation issues within our state, within key geographies, and develop plans with result chain analysis that show how we can accomplish OWEB's mission. And I think that, to me, that should be the real focus of the conversation: is how does OWEB, how do we all support these focused investment partnerships in delivering on OWEB's mission? And I understand that through those partnerships, those very successful partnerships, there have been more acquisitions that have come through and that have been ranked higher through those partnerships than was expected, perhaps by OWEB staff. And if that's the issue, let's talk about how to do that. If the issue is that some of the acquisitions don't seem to be fully aligned with the Focused Investment Partnership, then I think Dan Bell's idea of using the technical review teams that already exist to look at acquisitions and make that determination is also a great idea. We share the concerns you've heard that these current restrictions and rules will just limit the amount of acquisitions coming in and will have an unintended consequence of only having acquisitions come in with the most compliant landowners who are willing to work outside of a normal voluntary real estate market transaction. Asking a landowner to sign any document as much as 2 years in advance of closing is not something any other buyer in the market does. And we Land Trust and the state are all trying to conduct these projects within a voluntary real estate market. And so asking a landowner to get an attorney to review a document, to sign something before there's even a funding commitment, before there's an offer actually being made, is not a reasonable ask to make to a landowner. So that's the key point there. And then, as has been raised, the idea of never being able to shift anything within a biennium is also problematic because, as Dan said, circumstances change. We need to be able to respond to that to make sure as a conservation community, we are getting the best projects done, not just the ones that are available at the time a biennium starts. So thank you very much for hearing us out today. I also just want to point out that these Focused Investment Partnerships are made up of watershed councils, of state agencies, of local individuals, and most of the partnerships are identifying land acquisitions as their top or one of their very top strategies. It's not just the land trust community that cares about this. It's conservation supporters and advocates throughout the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for coming today. Amanda, are you there?
Hello.
Hi. Are you ready?
I am, yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. My name is Amanda Martino, and I'm the Executive Director of Blue Mountain Land Trust. We're a regional land trust working in southeastern Washington and eastern Oregon, and a member of the John Day Basin Partnership, a group of 30 county, state, federal, tribal, and nonprofit entities that have worked together over thousands of hours since 2014 to identify the top priority areas for conservation and restoration in the John Day Basin. We received FIP funding in 2019 and are halfway through our second biennium. I'm also a member of the Partnership Steering Committee and Technical Review Team. You will hear echoes of comments that my land trust colleagues have already made, but it's important to emphasize the wide-ranging impacts that these proposed changes will have. I specifically want to address item 3 in the draft application guidance that would prevent substitute or additional acquisition projects during a biennium. This proposed rule will prevent partnerships across the state from protecting critical fish and wildlife habitat and would preclude resulting restoration opportunities. While land trusts and our natural resource partners do our best to plan for acquisitions as far in advance as possible, we are unable to predict or control a private landowner's decisions to sell their land or consider a conservation easement. The flexibility to substitute or add in an acquisition project as high priority conservation areas become available ensures that our organizations can be as strategic and as high impact as possible, in turn ensuring that Measure 76 funds are deployed to achieve the greatest conservation outcomes. Our land trust and FIP are a great example of how flexibility for purchase in a biennium enabled us to secure a property of one of the highest ecological priority areas in the John Day Basin. At the time our FIP was planning for the biennium, Phipps Meadow, a property at the headwaters of the Middle Fork of the John Day River, was not for sale and not considered an option for future restoration. However, the property was listed for sale mid-biennium, and we were able to secure the purchase of one of the most critical pieces in our partnership's restoration focus areas. We are now working with OWEB staff to complete our land acquisition grant. As a result of this acquisition, we're partnering with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and the North Fork John Day Watershed Council to restore 1.58 miles of spawning and rearing habitat for mid-Columbia steelhead, Chinook, and bull trout. These result in critical conservation and restoration opportunities directly identified in our partnership strategic action plan are the direct outcomes of having flexibility in the FIP acquisition process. Furthermore, the FIP program rules would have precluded us from taking this project to the Land Acquisition Open Solicitation Grant Program, making this flexibility paramount to preventing lost opportunities to obtain high priority properties. Land trusts across the state understand how complex land acquisition projects are and how much time and capacity is needed to complete them. We want to work with OWEB staff and board to find ways to complete more conservation work, not limit opportunities. These partnerships have technical review teams that you've already heard about that could be better utilized to assist OWEB with evaluating proposed projects and fine-tuning proposals. Let us work with you to find solutions that increase our state's capacity to protect critical fish and wildlife habitat. In the face of ever-mounting data about the loss of biodiversity and quality habitat around the world, it is imperative now, more than ever, that we work together to increase the pace and scale of conservation, as the FIP program is intended to do, and not limit it. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Really appreciate you coming today and giving us some more information on what we're talking about today. All right, are there any more signups, Ivy?
Nope, that was all 4.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming today. We all really appreciate hearing from you. All right, I'm gonna pass the baton to Dan to do agenda item number 3, please.
Thank you, Barbara. And again, thanks to the public commenters. The next agenda item is the draft FIP application land acquisition guidance, and I'm going to hand it over to Eric Williams.
All right. Thank you, Co-Chair Brown, and members of the committee and those watching along on YouTube Live. Thanks again for the time from everyone to continue the conversation that we've been having with this committee and really with the board as a whole. And just as a reminder, we talked about this topic at the December Grants Committee meeting. And following that conversation, we decided to continue the discussion with some proposed parameters around land acquisitions in the FIP program. And I think some of the rationale for that was alluded to from some of the commenters that you just heard, that in the most recent cohort that we funded, this is the 3rd cohort of FIPs, 4 of those 5 FIPs have some kind of land acquisition activity in them. And as one of the commenters mentioned, we were seeing some kind of treatment of these projects that is really what we felt outside the boundaries of how the FIP program is designed. And there's a lot wrapped up into that in terms of what does that mean? And I think we've seen, not just in the land acquisition program, but I think across the board, a continued need for staff to focus on the kind of operational aspects of FIPs with partnerships, because some of the kind of tenets of the FIP program aren't maybe as well understood as we thought. And one of those is the strategic nature of the work proposed, and that's reflected in the work plans that come before the board. First, as a FIP initiative, when the board selects those applications to become FIPs, they do include the work plan for the first 2 years of the 6-year investment. And then in subsequent biennia, the partnerships come back before the board to not only give progress on where things stand with the projects that they're currently implementing, but also to provide a new work plan, a new pipeline of projects intended for the succeeding biennium. And that's the information that the board uses to determine whether or not to continue funding FIPs in their 2nd and 3rd biennia. So that's a really important part of the process. And something I think that perhaps is overlooked a little bit is that the FIP program itself represents somewhere between 25 and 30% of our core programs spending in our spending plan. And for that 25 to 30% of funds, the board sees that work plan project list, but doesn't actually award the grants individually. That is delegated to the executive director. And for land acquisitions in particular, of course, these are different in the sense that they are in perpetuity versus other project types that we fund. And I think that's a significant thing to keep in mind here, in that the awarding of those projects is delegated to the director. And so when things happen, like new projects coming in, projects being substituted and so forth, the board never sees those, has no input on them. in the funding process. And so that's, I think that's something for you all to consider as to, how you want to deal with that. But that was one of the factors that led to staff proposing this guidance for subsequent cohorts of FIP that come into the program, so that there's a clearer understanding of what exactly is intended to be funded under a particular FIP within each biennium. I think the issue of opportunism with landowners, things change for a landowner, for example, some of the things you heard in public comment, we do want to be flexible to allow those kind of transactions to happen. And that is the reason that our land acquisition rules allow for a look back period of 18 months prior to even submittal of the application for reimbursable funds under a particular transaction. That's how it is in open solicitation as well. And the program does allow, whether it's open solicitation or FIP, for paying for interest payments. Sometimes land trusts will take out a short-term loan to fund a transaction that comes up in an opportunistic way, and then OWIB can reimburse some of those costs. And I think, some of the comments that we heard today are, I think, worth pursuing. I think Dan Bell's point about technical review teams, having some sort of review role in those projects is a good one, and I think worthy of consideration. But going back to the rationale for the proposal that was before you, and I do want to emphasize that this is a piece of guidance, that this is not a set of rule changes that we're proposing to make. The program's administrative rules are at a bit higher level than this. But that rationale was to try to maintain the strategic nature of the FIP program. And some of the examples that Dan Bell alluded to, I think again, it's worthy of consideration. His comments about, gee, maybe those things could have been discussed through a TRT process to determine whether or not, a particular proposal makes sense in the context of what's already understood as the strategic action plan, actions that specifically are planned to be implemented in a FIP. We've just seen kind of a much more scattershot approach to that in the latest cohort of FIPs that we're trying to get a handle on. And I think Dan Royks also referenced staff capacity, which certainly is a part of this as well, because if we don't know what's going to come in the next 2 years, we have no ability to plan for either the staff that's going to be working on those applications or the contractor and DOJ assistance that we might need to review those applications, which is substantial in any individual land acquisition application. And if we see a FIP, for example, this is speaking purely hypothetically, that includes 2 land acquisition projects in it in a biennium, and then we end up with 4. Well, that's a doubling of the workload that we would have had no way of planning for. So that's those 2 things, both the strategic nature of proposed actions in a FIP and our ability to plan and manage support to make sure we're able to make those transactions happen, are the main drivers behind what was in the proposal. So I think what I'd like to do is stop here and first ask if other FIP staff have anything they'd like to add to that, and then come back to the committee members to see if you've got questions based on what you've heard during public comment, what you've seen in the draft guidance, and my remarks here today. So we have Jillian McCarthy, Denise Hoffer, Eric Hartstein as FIP staff on board today. And do any of you have anything to add to the comments around this guidance? Okay, seeing shakes of the head, no. So let's turn it back to committee members to see if you've got questions, comments, discussion points you want to talk through. You see Mark's got a hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So it appears to me that we have a disconnect and that we need to address this disconnect because of the testimony that's provided in writing and with the verbal stuff input that we've had. So I'm going to kind of talk off the cuff here for a little bit, and I don't profess to know all the details here, so I'm more than willing to be corrected if I get any of this wrong. So it seems like we need to have a statement right after the mission statement that says, before we get into land acquisition application requirements, that says something to the effect that OWEB is supportive of land acquisitions. We feel that it is a prime part of our directive in our mission statement. And these next, I'll call them requirements, or thinking about it should be the intent is to provide guidance here, not strict wording. In other words, I'm trying to figure out to make sure that we've built in the flexibility here. That is the intent, is to make sure that we can support land acquisitions, and that there are some issues that have occurred, and what staff's trying to do is tighten up some of these, but we need to make sure that we work with our partners, the land trusts, to make sure that we in fact can get these things through to fruition. And I liked, I don't know if it was Dan, well, a couple of them mentioned the technical review team review. So I kind of highlighted that and thought, there's a way that it wouldn't have to come back to, the OWEB board or the grants committee or somebody when we have an issue that comes up with, I think staff saying in some projects require 2 or more years from the time of the application submitted, the transaction is completed. And so reading from Dan Royk's letter here, the application occurs appropriately at various times within the biennium, not necessarily at the start of the biennium, requiring option agreement or a letter of intent at the start of the biennium poses an unnecessary burden or applicants. So it seems like we can address that with some kind of wording that addresses some of the staff concerns that they have there, to build in that flexibility so that we don't say, okay, we got to have your letter right away at the first of the biennium, and then we get an application that comes in halfway through the biennium and said, well, you didn't do that, so now you're out. So we got some kind of flexibility that could go back to the review team or some other entity, maybe you, Eric, or to the director to address some of that concern. Dan says there is the requirement this would cause conservation efforts to favor projects with lenders who are willing to incur additional expense along transaction teams and prioritize high priority projects. I was involved in I call it the Pridey Ranch lands acquisition, and I was really pleased how that went. And it took a long time to get that through with the Deschutes land trusts, and it was a really good project. But I'm sure there was some stuff going on behind the scenes with a lot of duck paddling underneath the water there. And then the other one that's in the item 3, preventing any substitute or additional acquisition projects during the biennium would result in the permanent loss of critical important conservation land. High priority acquisitions have been identified during the biennium, and it's critical. That's back to the point about sometimes things happen during the biennium. So I just said a whole lot there. So first, the comments about if we could get something up front that clearly says OWEB is supportive of land acquisitions, and this is input as guidance. We want to be flexible. We want to work with our partners here to get things done on the ground as efficiently effective as possible, but understand and address staff concerns. And we are having staffing issues. Hopefully we'll get some more staff through the biennial budget process, but we need to be very cognizant of staff and the time that it takes to do some of this stuff to make sure that we get it through. And then I really like the idea of this technical review team review or process where we can give them directions to insert themselves into there. So I'll be quiet. So if I got any of that wrong, or if anybody disagrees with me, please speak up. I'm more than happy to listen.
Thanks, Mark. Looks like Lindsay has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for all of the good public comment and discussion on this. And I think I kind of have a question, but more of a statement for my own process and understanding. The way that the guidance is written, it's specifically for land acquisitions within a FIP. So just a question, these guidance statements would not apply to the land acquisition through open solicitation because it doesn't really make sense because it's really fit focused. So that's a question. And then secondly, learning more about the FIP process, it sounds like folks who have been awarded a FIP and have an existing partnership can't step outside of that and apply to open solicitation land acquisition. Is that correct?
Thanks, Lindsay. Again, Eric Williams. And yes, correct on both counts. One, the guidance would not apply to open solicitation. And two, and this, gets nuanced, I think, and depending on the circumstances of each individual FIP. But the way that the rules are structured, if there are specific actions in specific geographies that are included in a FIP, those are prevented from coming in through open solicitation. And it is specific enough to be by project type. And so a FIP could say, in this one of 3 FIP watersheds, we're doing land acquisitions, but in the other 2, we're not. And then in those other 2 watersheds, they could come into open solicitation. So it's not a blanket exclusion. It really depends on how specific the partnerships get. And I think over time, we're seeing the partnerships think or pay a little bit more attention to that to avoid unintended consequences of keeping, whether it's acquisition or restoration or any other project type, to make sure that they're not hamstringing other partners in a region that they might want to work with on other project types.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Chris? You're on mute, Chris.
Appreciate that. Sorry. Thanks, Dan and Eric Williams. This might be a question for you. I definitely appreciated the testimony provided today and verbally and in writing. And for me, it's clear continued advocacy for flexibility with how the FIPS or acquisition programs currently implemented. But I also really have a lot of empathy for wanting a clear picture of workload for OWEB staff with administering the land acquisition pieces. And you had provided that example of a strategic plan coming in with 2 acquisitions proposed, and then maybe several additional acquisitions come up as an option, and you portray that as essentially a doubling of workload. And I guess I don't work within the acquisition world much, but I'm just trying to understand, is the OWEB staff workload associated with acquisitions, is it always the same for each acquisition? In other words, it seems to me that some acquisitions would be pretty straightforward, others would be heavily layered with complexities, et cetera. Could you speak to that a little bit just to help my understanding?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Again, Eric Williams, and certainly no 2 transactions are going to be the same in terms of number of hours required, amount of time our DOJ attorneys or contractors will have to spend. However, they all do, even the most, what we might call straightforward ones, still often have title issues that need to be resolved as part of the due diligence process. And that takes time and coordination to make sure that we get those addressed so that we've got a transaction in the shape that we need it to be at the time of closing. And certainly that workload is going to vary depending on the complexity of the title involved. But I don't think I've seen one yet that doesn't require any time on addressing title issues. They all require some time. The more complex that you have, and an example of complexities are if there are multiple owners of a property. We've had projects come in where it's not even clear who owns the property, and some work is needed to even figure that out. Who needs to approve this transaction, right? That's the most basic thing. But then you have other items like over the course of time, different access easements might appear on title for utilities, for minerals, for neighboring properties, for all kinds of reasons. And it takes work to understand the implications of those components of a property's title. And that's the kind of thing that staff and our contractors and our DOJ attorneys spend the time on to resolve. So our main thrust in all of that is making sure that the purpose of the investment, which is to invest in protection of a piece of property in perpetuity, specifically for habitat conservation, protection, restoration, so that that investment is sound. We're basically making sure that there's nothing in title that could be an activity that would be detrimental to whatever the habitat resource is that we're protecting. And so that's the reason for the workload. But you're absolutely right; it's going to vary from project to project, and 2 projects turning into 4 doesn't always mean a doubling of time. That's very much a generalization, but it's intended to provide kind of a basis for the conversation that it's not adding 10% to the workload. It's more like doubling the workload, but it is going to depend on what the issues are with each project for sure.
All right, thanks, Chris, for the question. Liza Jane.
Thank you, Dan. Eric, is it correct that we went from cohort 2, 1 out of 5? I mean, we really increased the request for acquisitions in our FIPS over the 3 cohorts. Isn't that correct? It went like clear high.
Yes, that is correct, Liza Jane. The cohort 2 FIPS, of which there were 5, had one of those 5 with land acquisitions incorporated in them, and that's the John Day FIP that Marty Martino is a part of, who commented earlier. And then the cohort 3 FIPS that were just awarded, there were 5 of those FIPS. 4 of them have land acquisition components. 3 of them would include OWEB funds for the purchase price. The 4th one would include OWEB funds for some due diligence costs, but with other funding sources paying for the actual land price.
Okay, thank you. That's what I understood. So, Mark, I would respectfully disagree with you that OWEB's prime mission, I think you said, is land acquisition. I think our prime mission is conservation of the land and habitat. And I think there's lots of ways to do that. Land acquisition is one of them, but it concerns me that that we seem, I have the sense that there's a belief that if land can't be acquired, then conservation can't occur on that land. And I would like to see more effort and creativity on how that conservation can occur without it being acquired. So I have some resistance there. I also, I don't understand, I think I heard in our public comment or read that it's not appropriate or possible to ask a landowner that's involved in an acquisition through a FIP to demonstrate that they have a commitment and that they understand what they're asking for and getting involved with prior to asking for money to acquire that land. I feel like that's foundational, and it doesn't have to be, I wouldn't imagine that it has to be a contract, full-on commitment, but at least for the board and the people making decisions whether that should move forward, we need to see that there's understanding from a landowner that's getting involved in an acquisition project prior to giving them money to acquire the land. That just, if I understand correctly, that's back asswards. So I think these guidelines are reasonable for workload, for staff, for the intention of the FIP. And we have another opportunity for acquisition for land and water. So I think I just want to say, from my understanding, I believe these are very reasonable. And that is with all respect to the public comment we heard. But I'm concerned about the trend of the FIP and land acquisition. So I think it's all right to have these expectations, and they're good suggestions from my viewpoint.
So Dan, if I could jump in, if I said prime, I stand corrected, Liza Jane. I definitely didn't mean that. I just meant that as part of our mission statement, to protect and restore healthy watersheds, natural habitats, and thriving communities are strong, that land acquisition is included in that mission part. So if I said it's the prime job, I definitely stand corrected. It's just part of our mission statement, does include that as it includes other things too. So
yeah,
thanks
and
for pointing me on that.
I accept that. I agree with that, but I don't think it is our main objective. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Liza Jane. Barbara?
Thank you. So, I'm intrigued with the thought of using the TRT. But I have a concern. I feel like it's a heavy lift for them even without this added review process, or like we already ask a lot of them. And I'd be curious, what time commitment do you think it would be if the technical review team was part of this process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barbara. And I think that basically what we would be asking the TRT is, to look at a proposed acquisition project to see how does this fit in with the stated FIP goals and actions. Is this the right action in the right place at the right time in terms of a proposed land acquisition project? And so it would involve the TRT members thinking about the strategic action plan, thinking about how the FIP was constructed, and if this is something new that has come up after the work plan was submitted, thinking about, should this be a priority? Because the other part of the equation is if you add a new project in, another project has to fall off, of equal value. And so the TRT has to weigh all of that. In terms of, the time commitment, if we were to do this, I think we would include it as a component of a regularly scheduled TRT meeting. And those happen with a lot of the FIPs twice a year. There's frequently a spring and a fall cycle. Some of them, it's an annual cycle. And so we would want to have it synchronized there so that we're not ramping up a whole extra meeting day, because as you point out, we are asking a lot of our TRT members. And so we're trying to keep the contact with them as streamlined as we can, recognizing that we have to incorporate site visits and a review team conversation, which can be anywhere ranging from 2 hours to a full day, depending on the number of projects coming before that particular TRT. So a little bit of a complicated question to answer, but I think we would probably want to devote a little bit more time to that question than we might for a project review. So it might add, another hour to a TRT meeting. And I'm just speaking off the cuff here because we haven't really thought through that question too much, but I think that's my best guess.
Well, and just to follow through on this, I appreciate it being tied into the same, a regularly scheduled review team meeting. I had a vision of like a whole nother day for it. So that's where I was like, that's a lot to ask. But if it was to happen, it could tie into that regular. That doesn't seem like it's very burdensome on the staff to incorporating it into an already scheduled meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I had a comment to make, but was there anybody else? Lisa, you had your hand up and then it came down. Was there something you wanted to say now, or did you want to wait a bit?
I'll wait a bit. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Okay. A couple of questions and thoughts for the example that Amanda Martino gave, talking about how this opportunity came up and they were able to be flexible under the current situation and make a land acquisition that seems like it was, very important to that FIP project in meeting the goals. Would these proposed changes eliminate the opportunity to do something like that in the future?
Thanks, Dan. Again, Eric Williams. No, they wouldn't eliminate it. And I think what we heard in the public comment is that the structure that's proposed in the draft guidance would say that each biennium you come in, with a list of projects. What I was hearing in the comments is once every 2 years is too long to wait. Even though we can reimburse for transactions that have happened prior to an application. That does entail often securing a bridge loan to do that, and I can understand why that isn't necessarily always the first choice for a land trust to want to enter into. So I think that was the crux of their comment, was that there's a structure in there to do that, to take advantage of new opportunities that come up, but there's too much of a time delay for that to be workable, is the comment that I was hearing.
Yeah. Okay. I think it boils down to that is the problem. It's a timing issue, right? It's sort of the people in the field are trying to maintain as much flexibility as they possibly can. And while we would love to provide that, it's very difficult to manage workload on the OWEB side, because there's a higher level of planning to include both staff and DOG to sort of work through sometimes some pretty complicated title issues like you talked about earlier. As compared to, again, I don't have, the years of experience with FIPS like other people on this call have, but as opposed to say like, just to help with some context, it's one land acquisition is one of many tools. And so as opposed to like an opportunity that arises using Liza Jane's example, where, the landowner doesn't necessarily want to sell their property, but they're newly open to the idea of some restoration work being done on their property. And if that wasn't included in the project list for the FIP, my assumption is that the FIP project could pivot to take advantage of that work. And so I'm trying to just, in my feeble brain, understand a little bit of that flexibility to pivot to new restoration work versus the flexibility to pivot to new land acquisition work. I fully understand the great example you gave, Eric, about the complexity in the title work, but are there other differences between the two? And what I'm thinking about, and sorry to be wordy, but I'll just throw this out. I'm thinking about going back to something that Lindsay brought up early on, is these, the open solicitation for land acquisition. And what I'm thinking about is if there's that big of a difference in pivoting on restoration work versus pivoting on land acquisition work, is there an opportunity to have more flexibility in the open solicitation program to accommodate that if we continue to move down the path of not being able to accommodate that in the FIP program? Hopefully that all made sense, and now
It did, yeah. Thanks, Dan. And I think that's kind of where this guidance is coming from. So the whole FIP program is predicated on a lot of thinking that goes into the strategic action plans that partnership is required to have. And those strategic action plans have a much longer timeline than the FIP, usually say 30 years versus 6. They often include a much larger geography, more actions. And so the partnership has prioritized what's the most important of all of these already high priority things in the strategic action plan. And that's what they come forward in a FIP application with. And if, they, having gone through all of that prioritization, it seems like there is a bit of a disconnect if something comes up that wasn't envisioned when they've already gone through that exercise that requires a lot of time and effort to say, these are our priorities in these places. and things that aren't on that list then can come into open solicitation. It keeps that option open. They can always come into open solicitation if they're not projects that are specified in the FIP work plan. And so that, that flexibility is always there. And, I think regarding your comment about, is there, what else is different other than the due diligence if we're substituting acquisition projects the way that sometimes restoration projects are substituted. And I think the difference there is that, the project pipelines that the partnerships have, which is that list of very specific restoration projects they want to do. When projects are substituted, it's typically a project that's already on that list that they're moving higher up because something fell through with a landowner agreement or something like that on a project that they had intended to fund. And that's not really what we're seeing with land acquisition. It's more of a kind of wide open, anything goes in this particular watershed. And I think, what we heard in the comments is, the land trust feel that's appropriate. We want to be as flexible as possible within that FIP geography. And so, there's a couple ways you can look at that. The maximum flexibility could be that if you're not ready to specify something, open solicitation is always there every year for you as a venue for those things. Or if you want to pick out, a particular geography and include that in your FIP, then, you're making a commitment that those land acquisition projects in that geography would be part of the FIP. And if they're outside of that identified geography for land acquisitions, then they'd come in through open solicitation. So, I think those are the reasons that the guidance was structured the way it was, to try to make sure that we're abiding by the strategic nature of the FIP the way it was intended. And then also, as we talked about, to address the staff capacity issues.
Thank you. Super helpful. Mark.
Well, so I do have a question now. So given what you've heard, Eric, and maybe this is a Lisa question about some of the concerns raised by the trust that talked to us today and what we've put out there and tried to answer questions. Do you see there's some, call it flexibility here? Is there an opportunity here for some flexibility to address what the staff's concerns are and an ability to address some of the concerns that are raised by the trust so that we can walk out of this meeting with some kind of a consensus that we are somewhat aligned on where we can go from here. Both parties say we can live with that.
I saw Lisa had her hand up a couple of times, so I think she has a thought, perhaps. If not, then I'll go. So go ahead, Lisa.
Thanks, Eric. So one of the things that I see as a big difference between the FIP acquisitions and open solicitation is the delegation to the director. When you all, board, approve a FIP, it moves forward. So if there are questions about a project within an acquisition, initially my sense was when I came here that the director asked questions, but suggesting more work wasn't necessarily very popular in that because it had been approved by the board way back when. One of the first acquisitions that I had that came to me through a FIP had some concerns, and I actually slowed the process because there were things that I thought still needed to be done, and the land trust went and did the work, and I very much appreciated it. And ultimately that one moved forward, but it slowed it down by probably 4-5 months because I had questions. And so when you're talking about delegating to the director acquisitions, these are big purchases. The board may have heard about it 2 or 3 years ago in that initial plan, but has not necessarily had a lot of interaction around it. The staff felt like there wasn't opportunity to push back or to ask for more work around these because they had been granted. I didn't feel that way. I'll just tell you, I felt like there were enough questions around the acquisition time and space that it needed a little more work, and I slowed it down. So some of this comes from a new director coming to OWEB, asking more questions about the process, having concerns about some of the process, asking for more work, and just taking it very seriously that when I'm asked to sign for, you know, $1 million, $1.5 million, a $2 million transaction, I take that very, very seriously. And, you know, wanting to make sure we have adequate process in it for the long term. And the public has been engaged in an appropriate way. I think if any of you've learned anything about me, I'm not about checking the boxes. I want to make sure we've had adequate engagement, and that was one of the issues in terms of one of the land acquisitions that I had concerns about was the engagement in the community that came back. So I do think the TRT process could help some review, or, you know, we could think about how to touch base again with the board potentially around some of these where they're high dollar transactions. Darn.
Thanks, Lisa. Mark?
So sorry to keep jumping in, but thank you, Lisa, for appreciate that. So I'm just wondering if, and I'll only speak for myself here, but I'm speaking for some other board members. Clearly, we operate at the 50,000 foot level. When we approve a FIP, we approve it with some general criteria that staff has provided to us, and we don't get in the weeds when we approve a FIP, and we delegate that to staff to do the weed work, the weeding, if you will. And so I personally don't want, you know, us to get in the weeds. I'd like to keep it either at the staff level with a TRT, or I'm going to look at Lisa when I say this, but, you know, potentially giving her the authority to say, okay, when we get into some of these issues that have been raised with staff and with Lisa and some of the trusts here about, you know, flexibility in this area, and we don't know where we need to be flexible and where we don't, because some things are going to come up with, we'll need more work. You know, another option would be to say, okay, we delegate that to the director to do the due diligence, to work with the trusts instead of the TRT. So potentially two options there. Then that way, even though it might extend it out a little bit further, it gives Lisa the authority and the check the box to say, I feel very comfortable about where we're going here. We've got a trust that's got a land acquisition that's come in halfway through the biennium. It's a good project, but I want to make sure we've checked all the boxes and the staff work and workload and all those kind of things. The other option would be, of course, to possibly do with the trust. And the third option is one of our members have said is just leave it alone and move forward. So those three options. So thoughts on that, folks?
Thanks, Mark. I'll jump in because I think I heard most recently Lisa saying that she was able to resolve problems and concerns and questions and move forward. And Lisa, thank you. You know, we trust that when there's that kind of expenditure that you're gonna do that. And then I also heard Dan Bell talking about the same thing, that it sound, and I don't know the sequencing of, you know, the write-up that we're talking about today versus the conversation that that was had with Dan Bell when he was saying that there were some circumstances that came up and people were able to get on the same page and resolve that. So that all seems pretty consistent with what Mark just said is, you know, these things that come up, whatever the details of them are, there seem to be pathways to solve them. But there, even within that context, there's still this bigger issue that has to do with planning and being able to sort of nimbly, you know, address those issues, particularly when things get more complicated. So I don't know what the right solution to that is, but I think that that we just want to make sure that we have, that the FIPS have access to all the same tools that they have now. Other folks want to react to what Mark said?
Well, can I ask Lisa, what's your thoughts? Would you be willing to have a little bit more delegated authority, or not? Maybe you already do. Would we just anoint you, I guess, to give you that delegated authority, or with full knowledge that we've allowed you to do that, or say, well, I don't have time for that, let's do the TRT, or how would you react?
So having had a little more experience with this, I'm comfortable at this point in that if I see issues, I'm going to either bring it back and have a discussion with the board, or I'm going to slow the process down. And that isn't always very popular because of the timing of some of these things, but it's important to me, and I think it's a responsibility that I have delegated to me, that we do it right when we're doing this work, and that our partners do it right and do adequate work in the community around any of the work that we do, you all delegate a lot of different authority to the director around grants, and that's fine. But I think up until I pushed back on the most recent one, it was assumed that once it was approved as a FIP, it would go. And it needed more work. And I think it was uncomfortable, especially as the first one that I did it with. I do like having the TRT look at it, those, to make sure it's a little more ready. I think there's a readiness piece as well. We can go back and I can work with staff around this, Mark. If the guidance isn't right and the board feels that there's need to maintain flexibility, we can figure something out. But no, if I will ask questions and around all of them.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Thanks everybody for a great discussion around this. Eric, did you want to sum anything up on this one before moving to the schedule item, or?
Yes, thanks, Dan. So what I'm hearing is to recraft this to incorporate a TRT process. I think, Lisa's comments, I don't think we need to build those into the guidance. I think those stand on their own. That as having the delegated authority role, she will continue to ask questions as needed. I do want to go back to the other components of the guidance. We heard that numbers 2 and 3 on the draft guidance propose significant problems. And so if we kick those to the TRT process, I didn't hear any heartburn with number 1, which is simply that a summary of each proposed project is including the transaction approach and timing, who the lead organization is, what their objectives are, and how they align with the FIP ecological outcomes is included in first the initiative level work plan, and then in subsequent progress reporting for the out year biennia 2 and 3. So I wasn't hearing any problems with that one, nor with number 4 on the draft guidance, which is basically what Lisa was getting to, which says simply that despite being in a FIP, they're not absolutely assured of funding until all the funding conditions have been met, and which, I think that's standard regardless of where a project pops up. So I just wanted to make sure we close with clarity on that we would delete numbers 2 and 3, replace those with a TRT type review process, and keep numbers 1 and 4 in the draft guidance. I'm seeing some nods on that. So good. I just want to make sure we're clear before we moved on. And I know we only have one item left, but we are bumping up towards the last 20 minutes or so of our allotted time.
Okay. I think, go ahead, Barbara.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and I do have to leave at the stroke of noon today, just FYI, if you see me jump off. And we're going to move on down to agenda item number 4, 2023 Grants Committee meeting schedule. Who's taking that?
I can take that one, Barbara. Thank you. Again, Eric Williams. And this, we'd like to make an adjustment to our regular meeting schedule. Today's meeting, of course, was a specially scheduled one, but typically we're meeting in the first week of the month prior to a board meeting. And it's come to our attention that we do conflict with the Board of Forestry meeting, and we do not want to preclude our newest member from attending Grants Committee meetings. And I think we can accommodate this with a simple change in the schedule. And what we had been doing as a typical schedule is meeting on the first Thursday of the month, typically at 9 o'clock, 9 to 10:30. And so I'd simply suggest moving that to the second Thursday to see, or I'm sorry, there's a little bit of confusion here because some of the dates are the first week, some of the dates are the second week
I know.
of the month. And so what we do need to do though is make sure that we can accommodate. And I think if we said the third Thursday, we would be safe. Is that right, Liz?
It is. We've this 2023, we decided not to just have a one-day meeting on Wednesday, but include 2-day meetings, which makes a lot of sense. But it's the first Thursday after the first full Wednesday. It depends when the month starts. So if you all would be very, accommodating and move it to the third Thursday, that would be really helpful. So thank you for that proposal.
All right. Any issues with third Thursday from any of the committee members?
Well, I've got a commission meeting on the third Thursday. On the 20th of April, I have a commission meeting, so an ODF&W commission meeting. So, but that looks like the only one that's going to conflict.
Oh, that's a different month though, Mark. So we would be talking about March, June, September.
Okay, so March would be the 23rd. Is that
the
correct?
16th?
I have a joint committee commission meeting with DEQ, the DEQ commission on the 16th. So.
Okay.
I have a standing, ironically, third Thursday meeting starting at 11 a.m.
Let's do this then. Let's send a doodle poll out with some potential options. And see if we can come up with a regular date, and we'll post the results of that on our website, and of course let you all know. All right.
Ivy's got her thumbs up.
Which I'm very happy to see.
All right, I like that idea, Eric. The doodle is probably a lot easier. I've got a big calendar to look at too, and I have not looked at it, so a doodle poll would be helpful.
Great.
Anything else on that? All right. Anything else at all for the good of the order today? Nothing from Lisa, nothing Hartstein, nothing to add?
Thank you for the productive conversation.
Yeah.
Liza Jane has a hand up.
Oh, sorry, I did not.
It
see
blends
that
with
one.
her ceiling color, so
It
it's hard to
does,
see.
yeah, it does.
You're on mute, Liza Jane.
You're on mute, Liza Jane.
I'm not. Okay. I want to just close by being able to say that I think just how much I appreciate public comment in letter or calling in and joining us. I think it measures our success when the people we're serving are included in our decisions and they feel welcome to share that information with us. I just really, really want to emphasize how valuable that is. So, and I wish you all well until we meet again.
Thanks, Liza Jane. All right, so not seeing any more business that needs to be cared for today, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.